In 2026, Six Flags Over Texas is getting a new coaster, Tormenta. It'll break half a dozen records when the gate finally drops, but today I'm only interested in this. That 179-foot vertical loop is objectively impressive, but there might not be a Tormenta at all if it weren't for another record-breaking coaster that currently sits watch over the property. Shockwave. See, loops haven't always dominated the skylines of theme parks, even though they've been around since the late 1800s. And there's a good reason they didn't catch on. Because the earliest roller coaster loops weren't fun, they were awful. So if you want to know how this gave us this, stick around, get comfortable, and let's see if we can get from 1895 to 2026 by way of 1978. This is Flip Flap Railway, a roller coaster at Coney Island. In 1895, it technically had the title of World's Tallest Vertical Loop because it was the only one, at least in America. But Flip Flap's loop was a near-perfect circle, which means it had the same radius and curvature throughout the whole experience. The plan sounds easy enough. Build a circle, make sure the train has enough speed, and let nature take its course. But that's where the problems start. At the entry point of the loop, the train is moving as fast as it can, and the total curvature gets applied immediately and fully. Now, I hesitate to quote how many G's these poor folks were crushed under, but I will say that these folks were enduring something that would be more suitable for these folks. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter if Flip Flap pulled 8 G's or 80. Loops became something the public simply didn't trust and certainly didn't want to experience again. Getting a ride vehicle to go upside down wasn't the problem. The problem was how to manage the forces that come along with it. Because this is the difference. Same idea, different outcome. This is what Flip Flap used. This is constant curvature, and it hits hard both coming and going. Force doesn't have an opportunity to build, and even worse, the force gets applied at the exact moment the train is going its very fastest. So, what's the solution? Well, it turns out the solution wasn't changing the motion, it's changing the shape. Instead of a perfect circle, you stretch it. Make it nice and wide at the bottom and tight at the top. If you vary the curvature, the force comes right along with it. Now, the load doesn't arrive all at once. The riders will experience a gradual, predictable journey into the loop, so the forces stay nice and manageable. As the train climbs up and slows down, the curve tightens before sending the riders back down the other side at that same extended curvature. This shape has a name. It's a clothoid loop, and they can be found everywhere from the highways to the skyways and in all kinds of places you'd never expect. But what clothoid loops did for coasterdom was to make something parks could use again and again and again. That's how you go from a loop that nearly killed loops to something like Tormenta. That 179-foot loop only works because the problem has already been solved. But if you want to understand how it was solved, let's look at one of the first coasters to ever implement the clothoid loop. Alright, let's look at the RCDB and see what we're dealing with. At the bottom of the loop, the train is moving its fastest, and the track has to pull that train inward so it follows the curve. That inward pull is described by this. That's centripetal acceleration. It equals velocity squared over the radius of the curve. That also means that if the speed doubles, the force quadruples. Centripetal acceleration is one thing, but what riders actually feel is the g-force. Now we're talking about how hard you feel like you're getting pushed into the train. All we do to the acceleration formula is multiply the radius by gravitational acceleration, which is 9.81 meters per second squared. Now, let's take a look at shockwave. Top speed is 60 miles per hour, which we're going to call 26.8 meters per second. If we estimate the loop's bottom radius at 14 meters, we get a respectable 5.25 G's at the bottom. As it climbs up, it slows down because it's exchanging speed for height. If we estimate that climb at around 20 meters, we can represent that here. So by the time the train reaches the top of the loop, it has slowed down significantly, from 60 to around 40, and that completely changes the force, because remember in our equation, speed is squared. So losing speed has a massive effect on force. Mathematically, it looks like this. Speed and radius both change as you move through the loop, so the force unfolds and evolves smoothly and predictably. So now that we know what's going on, let's take another look at Tormenta. Our challenge here is that the first element off the drop is that record-breaking 218-foot Immelmann, and not the vertical loop. So by the time that train enters the loop, it'll have already spent some of those 87 miles per hour. But if we look just at the Immelmann's front half, we can do the same kinds of calculations. Tormenta's published top speed is about 87 miles per hour, and this Immelmann reaches about 218 feet. If we convert that to metric, that's about 38.9 meters per second and 66.4 meters of height. So we can use the energy equation from shockwave climbing that loop to estimate the speed at the top. So we plug in the numbers, simplify, and there we have it. And you get about 32 miles per hour at the top. That's less than half the entry speed, and as we've already learned, this is excellent news. Just like shockwave purchased height with speed, Tormenta does the same thing. One of the reasons Tormenta doesn't exit its loop with an empty train and a pink mist on the breeze is because the height is appropriate for that speed. Even if Tormenta's loop was a perfect circle like flip-flap, the size is helping to keep the forces down. Now that we're well versed in the math behind loops, I want to take just a quick second and take a look at a water slide from New Jersey in the 1980s. Yeah. Flip-flap proved that loops were possible. Clothoid loops proved they were repeatable. Now all the world needed was someone who understood it and someone who could build it. Those two legends are Werner Stengel and Anton Schwarzkopf, the Lennon and McCartney of roller coasters. Stengel was the engineer and Schwarzkopf was the builder. Anton Schwarzkopf was building rides in Germany in the 50s and 60s. He had his own manufacturing company and he was a well-known steel fabricator. He was already making attractions that were mechanically sound, but as things became larger and more complex, he absolutely could not afford to risk his reputation on another flip-flap. Schwarzkopf needed someone who could handle the intricate calculations that would be needed for the attractions of the future. Meanwhile, Werner Stengel was an engineering student. His passions were in physics, particularly motion. He was working on some early ride projects when Schwarzkopf hired him as basically a consulting engineer. The thing is, they were an amazing team. Stengel was amazing at knowing how rides were going to feel and doing the math to make them work. Schwarzkopf was a master fabricator who already had a well-known name in the amusement community. Once their partnership started producing incredible results, parks came to them instead of doing all their designs in-house. Six Flags decided to be the first amusement chain to make that call, and that decision could be dangerous. In 1976, that decision shows up at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Revolution, the first modern looping coaster in the United States. It was risky for a number of reasons. It didn't just loop. It had to loop all day with real people riding it under changing weather conditions. But it worked. Revolution's loop transformed inversions from awful to awesome and kickstarted the next generation of roller coasters. 2 years later, in 1978 at Six Flags Over Texas, the world's tallest coaster arrived with 2 back-to-back loops instead of 1. Shockwave. Yes, it has a stellar pedigree and the stats to match, but its lasting contribution is that it proves Clothoid loops were stable and comfortable enough to design an entire attraction around. Shockwave proved that loops could be trusted, comfortable, and even enjoyable. That same year at Six Flags Over Georgia, Mindbender opened with 2 classic vertical loops like Shockwave and then something different. It has a high-speed turnaround that uses similar force-shaping geometry to keep everything well under control. Centripetal acceleration really doesn't care what direction you turn or what axis you revolve around. It only cares about how fast you're moving and how tight the curve is. If that turnaround dumped its full force on riders at once, it would have been a failure, but it, like the two vertical loops, worked beautifully. One of these days, I have got to make a pilgrimage out to Georgia and ride this thing. It's almost identical to Shockwave through that first loop, but the rest of the layout feels a little more composed, mature, confident, maybe? I know this came out the same year Shockwave did, but it really feels like the next generation of that idea. Once the Clothoid loop solved the problem of safe inversions, other manufacturers took notice almost immediately and started adding their own touches. Then, when computer-assisted drafting became the norm, pure clothoids began getting replaced with bespoke geometry that continues to thrill and impress us all today. The shapes and styles may differ, but the same idea is still behind it all. Six Flags intersects with so many things we take for granted in theme parks these days, but the loop might be the most important. Take your favorite roller coaster, no matter where it is, and remove the inversions. Changes the quality, doesn't it? Let's look at Tormenta again and its record-breaking elements. It almost feels poetic that the world's largest vertical loop is back at the park that helped prove they could work in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, I would deeply appreciate a like, a subscribe, and maybe even a share. Until next time, I hope to get stuck in line next to you.